During her childhood, her mother suddenly uprooted the family, not once, but twice, with no warning, no explanation. It was a deep, dark secret she didn't learn until she was in her 20s. And even then, there was much more to uncover. The story belongs to journalist Pauline Dakin, and she's now laid out the whole unbelievable story in her book, Run, Hide, Repeat, a memoir of fugitive childhood. She's an assistant professor at the University of King's College School of Journalism in Halifax, and Pauline joins us now. Such a pleasure to meet you.
It's nice to meet you, Nam.
Could not put your book down. Oh, my heart was racing. So you spent your childhood, and your childhood was full of secrets. You were told not to say anything that was happening in the family, keep it in the family. Yeah. And then now all these secrets are now in a book for everybody to read. Why did you want to write the book?
Originally, I started writing it because I needed a way to tell my children what had happened. And I wanted it to be told in a nuanced way. I didn't want them to be angry at some of the people who'd played such difficult roles in my life. So I wanted them to understand the layers of the story. So that's how it started. But as I began to kind of go back into that story myself, I found it very helpful to kind of impose a narrative on what the heck had gone on in our lives.
Helpful how? In what way? I mean, how was it helpful?
I think for so long I had tried to forget what had happened to us and just move on, and I'm going to have a career and a family, and I'm just going to forget about that. And I think at a certain point in life, you need to go back and take stock. And so helpful in the sense of coming to terms with what had happened, and ultimately helpful in forgiving the people who'd been involved, who were people that I loved. And it was a lot of work dragging around the anger I had for them.
I mean, speaking of anger, what's it been like for you to relive these moments every time you do an interview, beyond just writing it in a book?
Yeah. At some point, it becomes an interview. I remember the first time I spoke publicly about this, my heart was pounding, and it was very difficult. It becomes less difficult as you do it more often, but at the same time, I think I always have a few moments after where I feel there's a cost to it.
You moved around a lot, picked up, left, no explanation. Yeah. Why did you move around so much?
Well, I didn't know until I was in my 20s. All we knew was that once we went on vacation from North Vancouver, where we were living, to Winnipeg, and then we're told, hey, we're never going home. And then the other time we were told we were moving, but we were sworn to secrecy.
And the first time, how old were you?
The first time I was 7, and the second time I was 13. So it wasn't until I was 23 that my mother called me and said, okay, you've always wanted to know what the heck was going on now. You're old enough. So we got together and she told me.
Who was Stan Sears?
Stan Sears was a United Church minister in North Vancouver, and he came into my family's life because my mother went to Al-Anon, which was the support group for families of alcoholics. She was quite depressed. She was trying to leave an abusive marriage to my dad, and he was an alcoholic. And people there recognized she was fairly fragile. And somebody there said, oh, you need to go see Stan Sears. He does counseling. So she went and had counseling with him. And then we began to go to his church on Sundays. So that's how I came to know him, as the minister of that church. And then his family and our family became quite close. We'd go on vacation together, camping. We would spend, we'd have Christmas dinner or Easter dinner together. And interestingly, when both times that we just kind of disappeared and moved away, we did it in lockstep with them. So he and his wife would move at the same time we did. So of course, my brother and I always thought, what's that about? And we wondered, well, is it sort of, support for mom? Does mom feel she needs their support? Because they were very supportive friends.
Did you ask your mom why?
Yes.
And what did she say?
She didn't say. There were just certain things that she didn't talk about. And she would say, I can't talk to you about that right now, someday when you're older. So that was the refrain.
So now you're older. You're
I'm
23 years old.
I was 23.
And what does she say to you when you're at this motel?
She asked me to meet her at a motel. And actually, when I walked into the motel,
Stan was there.
Stan was there. And I was stunned because he'd retired. He and his wife had retired and moved back out west. Anyway, the two of them sat me down and said the reason that all these bizarre things had happened was that we'd been on the run from the mafia. And that further to that, my dad had been involved in organized crime. And so that was sort of how we got looped in.
And that's what Stan and your mom tell you.
Yep.
What is your reaction?
Well, I was a young journalist. And so, I tend to ask questions about things. But I have to say, I was terrified because of the people who were telling me this. My mom was somebody who really valued honesty and trust and talked about that a lot. And I knew her to be a very honest person. And Stan, the same thing. These were good people doing good things, well respected in the community. And I thought, why would they make this up? What do they stand to gain from it? So part of me was thinking, this is impossible. This is crazy. But another part of me was saying, well, but why would they lie?
And you also had a sense of relief, didn't you?
Well, yes, it did explain things. They sat me down, and over a period of a weekend, we had this conversation where they would be saying, now, do you remember this that happened? And I'd say, yes. Well, here's why. And so, this story did actually explain, it was an explanation for the crazy things that had happened all through my childhood and my brother's childhood. So in that sense, it made puzzle pieces kind of fit into place. And I couldn't think of any other possible explanation for all those crazy things that happened. So I kind of felt at war. Is this real? But I was afraid.
Well, you're right. As I drove away from the Bluebird Motel, I could feel many eyes on me, Mom's, Stan's, and those of the unknown men who are now part of my life, always somewhere in the background, unseen, watching me and anyone who came near me. The previous afternoon, Stan had asked if I would give permission for a tracking beacon. Okay. The previous afternoon, Stan had asked if I would give permission for a tracking beacon to be attached to my car to make it easier for my coverage to follow me without being too close or too obvious. I was torn between wanting to defend my privacy, my fast dwindling feeling of freedom, on the one hand, and on the other, the feelings of fear that finally made me nod my head in agreement to the request. So after Stan tells you this story, he says, we have these people who are watching us to make sure that, that we're safe, that you're safe. And so that's why he suggested the tracking device. That feeling that you now felt, did that disappear with time?
No, actually, it intensified for a while. Eventually, it settled down, I guess. That was the part of the story, where I'm talking about those other people is that, they had also said that there was this kind of anti-organized crime task force that was, fighting organized crime, that it had, the Privy Council had approved it. It was run through military tribunal trying people involved with organized crime.
And it was top secret.
It was top secret. So how do you, that's the problem. How do you check the reality of something that nobody will ever admit it exists? And so that there were these people that provided protection for, for people like my family who'd been caught up in organized crime. So I found that incredibly creepy, that people were kind of following me, even though they were supposed to be protecting me. That idea I found creepy. But at the same time, I found it terrifying. Everything you hear in popular culture about the mafia is that you can run, but you can't hide. They're going to get you. So I was, on the other hand, quite happy to think that if this is all true, okay, I guess I'm glad to have somebody looking out for me.
But you seem to be a bit paranoid after that. You went home, you had this lovely bush in front of your house that you cut down because you wanted to make sure no one was hiding.
That's right.
How did you deal with the news? Were you able to tell anybody?
No. So I was told, you can't tell anybody this story First of all, no one will believe you. They'll think you're crazy.
And then you had a fiance at the time, too.
I did, yeah. And second of all, you could be putting people at risk by telling them this. So yes, and I almost told him a couple of times, and then I didn't. And so yeah, I felt very isolated. I went home to, my life, working as a reporter covering school board meetings and council meetings, and unable to talk about the thing that was really preoccupying me, which was this idea that my family was under threat. And so I felt very isolated and increasingly paranoid, because some of the stories that I'd been told were about times that somebody had tried to poison somebody in the family. And so, yeah,
And Stan and your mom also had like a big secret within themselves, between them. What did they tell you? What was happening between them?
That they had fallen in love, that they'd been in love for many years, but that when Stan retired and he and his wife Sybil moved back west again, Stan had gone inside, meaning he had gone into this sort of secret world to work with the anti-organized crime task force, and Sybil didn't want to come, so that they were now separated. And so now Stan and Mom wanted to be together. So my mother was planning to go inside into protective custody as well, and they would be together there.
And they called it the Weird World.
They called it the Weird World.
You liked Sybil, Stan's wife.
Yeah.
What did you think about that news, that they were together?
Oh, I found that very difficult. And of course, that news came in the midst of all my sort of notions about my life and the people in my life as they were all disintegrating around me. So it was just one more layer of this bizarre and new information.
Did you think about talking to your dad about this?
Never. No. My dad really had never been very involved, even before all of this had started. Mm-hmm. He was alcoholic, and he had difficulties. He could be a very kind man, but he was not somebody who liked to talk about things. And I just didn't really have much of a relationship with him. And so he was described to me as somebody who was actively plotting against my mother and Stan, and sometimes even me and my brother.
And you were close with your brother. Yeah. How did your brother react to this?
Well, he didn't find out right away. It was a little bit later when Mom and I went to Vancouver, where he was living, to tell him about this. The idea being to tell him before she went inside. And I had decided, okay, fine, I'll go inside too. So we were going to tell him about this. And it was a terrible thing to do. I remember it was another motel room, and we're all, Stan is there again, and we're telling him, or Stan and Mom are telling him this, and I'm watching him, and I can just see him bowing under the weight of this, and he's getting up and pacing, and I just thought, what a terrible thing it is to do this to my brother. And eventually, our perspective on things changed. And he was always Doubting Thomas. My mom called him Doubting Thomas because maybe he should have been the journalist.
Well, I was going to ask you this because, as after you find this story and more things are going to come out, did you ever question yourself in the sense, like, why didn't I see what was happening?
Oh, of course, yeah. Yeah, I was so ashamed that I had allowed it to go on as long as it did. Yeah, because of course it wasn't real. Mm-hmm. And I guess, that again, the process of writing this book and really examining what happened and consciously remembering these things was helpful to me for that reason too. I realized, if you grow up in an environment where from the time you're a very young child till the time you're an adult, your family is behaving in strange ways, and there's always this sense that something dire is going on, but you don't know what it is, then an explanation that is very strange maybe is not that strange in those circumstances, Mm-hmm. If that's what you grow up with, maybe you come to expect something pretty unusual. Part of me knew for a long time that this was probably not real, but I also knew that if I acknowledged that and said to Stan and Mom, this is crazy, that I was now going to be on the outside. I thought that would be the end of my relationship with both of them. And Stan had become like a father to me, and my mom and I were very close, and it took me a long time to get the courage up.
You were scared.
I was scared that it would be the end of my relationship with them. So eventually I reached the point that I needed to know one way or the other. And so I guess I decided to test it. I set up a bit of a sting. And I waited until, so Stan used to fly around the country back and forth visiting my mother while she waited to go inside. And at a time I knew that he would be visiting her, I called her and I said, somebody's broken into my house. They hadn't, but that's what I told them. And she said, oh, wait a minute, I'll call you back. I'll talk to our friend and call you back. And of course you spoke that way because the lines were probably bugged. And so I waited. It was a terrible wait for the phone to ring again. And she said, yes. He says, our guys have picked up 2 people that were in a car outside your house. There was evidence they've been following you, taking photographs of you. They were looking for certain things in your house.
In that moment when she said that,
the whole thing came tumbling down.
Your heart just sank, huh?
Oh, and I knew it meant the whole thing was a hoax. And, once again, everything I understood about the world was upside down.
But I mean, it's not even that simple, because you had been forced to move a couple of times. Your relationship with your dad was changed. Relationships with people that you cared about before in the past.
Yeah.
So this meant that there's something behind all that, and this could be what caused it.
Yeah, this was what caused it.
Were you angry?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, I was angry for years after that. I confronted first my mother and said, it's not real, here's the evidence. And she was horrified, but not for the reason I expected. She was horrified because she was worried that, oh no, if she doesn't believe this, she'll put herself in danger. Because always when something like that happened, it turned out there was some explanation, right? So, and sure enough, when I confronted Stan, he said, oh, well, there's been some kind of mistake. We're going to do an investigation. And, and so for years after that, I only saw Stan another time or 2 after that. And naturally, nothing was ever the same. And my mother and I were kind of at war. We didn't want to let go of each other, but we were spent, a lot. I would try to convince her it was all a hoax, and she would try to convince me it was real, and, refer to, that she'd seen certain evidence.
It changed your relationship.
It changed the relationship, yeah.
Why would Stan lie?
Well, that was the question, because Stan was a good person. In every respect that you would measure by.
You called him Papa.
I called him Papa, yeah. And, people really regarded him as a good person and respected him, and why would he make this crazy thing up? And so I just thought that I was going to have to live with that question for the rest of my life and not know the answer until I started looking into my own story again and writing about it. And doing some research around that. And, for years after that whole kind of sting, I went to see a psychiatrist to say, okay, tell me, what the heck could be going on here? What would explain this behavior? And, because he was clearly not psychotic or schizophrenic or any of the other major mental illnesses that is, associated with delusion. And I just did not believe that he was
a bad person,
trying to hurt us for some unexplained reason. And this psychiatrist really didn't have a good explanation. He said that my mother could have been caught up in a delusion that this guy had because of something they call folie à deux, which is where, a strong, compelling personality, such as, Stan had, can sometimes kind of pull somebody else into a delusion and they will believe it. And there are all kinds of stories about that in the literature. Jim Jones, is a great example of that. How many hundred people died drinking the Kool-Aid because he said so.
Hearing that from a professional, did that put you more at ease beyond thinking that why would somebody who professed to love me and my family do this?
No, I actually didn't feel any satisfaction from that. And so, for years I would continue to do research. And then, of course, Google comes along, and that's very helpful. But I never really came across anything that could explain this, because in every respect, Stan seemed completely normal. Until one day I was reading a medical journal article, and it was about something called delusional disorder. And as I read it, all the bells went off, and I thought, this is Stan. This is exactly what he looks like. And so...
Which is what?
Okay, so delusional disorder, which is, in the literature, it's described as being extremely rare. So only a tiny fraction of the incidence of, say, schizophrenia. I think it's probably more common than that, but it's under-recognized. And essentially, people with delusional disorder can look completely normal. Their delusion is a very fixed belief, but they kind of put it in a little envelope, and they can look completely normal and not have the side effects that you see in schizophrenia or psychosis. They're not obviously mentally ill, and they don't think there's anything wrong with them, so they don't go looking for help. They don't present themselves to psychiatrists and say, help me. So that explains why it's probably more common than the numbers that are in the literature, right? But it's a difficult thing to recognize, it's a difficult thing to diagnose, and it's a difficult thing to treat.
Well, because after you confronted your mom and you confronted Stan, you saw Stan twice more after, right? And then his relationship with your mom was it ever really the same?
Well, yes, they continued to have a relationship, but he died.
And his wife, Sybil, sent you letters.
And we got letters from Sybil saying that he died.
What was that like for your mom?
Oh, it was awful. Now, I mean, the story had always been that Stan had a double who sometimes dropped in and out of his life with Sybil to make it look like he was still around Sybil. Very convenient. And so, you know, Mom assumed that the weird world somehow let Sybil know and Sybil let us know. But it was still a devastating thing, you know. He'd had an aneurysm and, you know, just dropped off the face of the earth. And months went by before Sybil wrote. And so she was sick with worry and then sick with loss.
And you've lost a lot in this process, have you not?
Yeah, I would say, yeah. So my brother and I, you know, essentially lost our relationships, at least for a very long time, with our dad and with our extended family. And, you know, every time we moved, you would lose all those friends and relationships. So a lot of severed relationships.
But even personally, because you're always, you know, how do you know who to trust? Always living like, you know, people are following us. How do you feel safe?
Yes. So, yeah, that was very difficult for a long time. But, you know, the discovery that it wasn't true began a process for me where I had to, you know, just talk to myself every time. I remember being in a Tim Hortons one time, and a Mountie walked in, and then a few minutes later another walked in, and then I look up and there's 4 of them there, and I'm thinking, something's going on. It's like, no, you know, they're having coffee. So I had to sort of, for a while, talk myself down from that high alert feeling of watching over your shoulder. I don't feel that anymore at all. So I feel as though I now successfully live as though, you know, none of that was real.
And you've forgiven Stan?
Yes. You know, my feelings around Stan are still kind of complex, but yes, I don't feel that he was trying to harm my family anymore, and so that helps. I have, in the case of my mother, you know, writing about our story and writing about her and, you know, what her life was even before all of this began, I really felt as though I got to know her in a different way, and I feel a huge empathy for her. And, you know, what a difficult life she had. And yes, I've completely forgiven my mom.
And you were able to reconnect with your dad?
Yes, before he died.
But you never told him what happened?
I never did, because he was never a very involved dad to start with, but also he was quite sick by the time, he had emphysema. So he was quite sick by the time I was reconnecting. And I just decided I couldn't think of anything to be gained by telling him. And he never once in my life had asked me, why do you disappear and then not turn up for years? You know, why haven't you written to me? Why haven't he just never seemed to have any curiosity about it? So
why not tell him? I feel like
because I thought it would enrage him. As I think if it was me, I'd be enraged. And you know, in the condition that he was in, that would not be good for him.
Now, having written the book and looking back, what do you think is the biggest lesson that you've taken from this experience?
Well, I think there are a few. One is that you just never know what's happening to the person next to you. And, you know, I often wondered, what did the teachers say when I didn't turn up for class on the Monday morning? I don't think that could happen these days with the internet and social media, but, you know, you just never know what the story is of somebody that you're encountering in your life. But I think from the perspective of a mature person now, what I take away is I'm okay after living this very traumatic life, ironically, because of the kind of mother I had. So yes, she put us in these chaotic situations that were very difficult. But there was never a time, and my brother would say this too, there was never a time that either one of us questioned that she loved us, that she supported us, that she was proud of us. And I think when you look at the research around resilience and what gives people resilience to get through difficult things, having that key adult who's always got your back and makes you feel part of something and loved is so important. So I benefited from that.
And I think too, like as we get older, we realize that our parents were people before they had us.
Absolutely, yeah, with all kinds of reasons that they may be vulnerable and weak in different ways.
Thank you so much for writing this and showing us that forgiveness is possible even after something this difficult.
Thanks for your interest.
It's been nice to talk to you.
And to you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.